Hello, in this video we're going to talk about the payroll section of settings. As you can see on the main page here, the payroll default setting is block. Go ahead and go into the payroll settings themselves. We have the standard category of payroll settings that have been included in APDL by default. Of course, as we have in other sections of settings, we have the ability to create our own custom payroll categories as well, and those would show up below the standard section here. We don't have any at the moment. In this case, we can edit some of the settings for each of the standard payroll categories, or we can create our own from scratch. Let's go from the start. Let's go with block. That's the most common, that's the most simple to explain, and that's what most people are going to use the majority of the time. This category is entitled block. You can change that if you like. If you refer to it as something different at your airline. Under the options section here, does this payroll category apply to flight time? We tend to gravitate toward wrapping our mind around everything in APDL is a flight. But there are some things that we would need to put in APDL now with regulations as far as Part 117 that we now need to keep track of that are not flights. For example, ground school or training or reserve or things of that nature. So in this case, block is flight time. So we're going to count that toward our logbook, and it is flight time. Apply to legality. Is this duty? Does it go toward 117 regulations as far as are you on duty? Yes. In this case, if I'm making a flight, I'm in flight, then that is part of my duty. It is applying to legality. Apply to pay. For the purposes of payroll calculation, do I get paid for this? Absolutely. So that's turned on. Is this flight a return to gate? In this case, it is not. That does change a couple of things that APDL does. In this case, that is not the case. Set all legs to this type. What that does is if you, for example, let's say you call out sick for a trip. You have your entire trip preloaded in APDL, and day one of your trip, you're sick, you call out sick, and you go in APDL. Now you're going to have 10, maybe 15 flights that you're going to have to go through each individual flight and change the payroll category to sick. If you enable this set all legs to this type, it will allow you to change just one leg to sick, and it'll ask you, do you want to set all the legs to sick or just this leg? Now you don't want to have that pop up every single time you change your payroll category, so that's why we have this setting here to disable that. The above guarantee option here, it's pretty self-explanatory. Say you pick up an additional flying trip on your day off, and that counts above guarantee for you. In this case, a regular block entry is not above guarantee, but if we selected that option, it would tell the payroll system that, hey, this goes above guarantee. For block, this is our standard pay rate type of entry, so override pay rate doesn't make sense in this case. But let's say this was a day off pay type of trip. I could say, well, on this day, instead of getting paid, or on these types of flights, instead of getting paid my standard pay rate, which is set in the airline settings of APDL settings, my pay rate for this is a certain flat amount in a dollar amount. You can turn that on if that applies. Minimum credit. This is where you could put in a minimum day guarantee. For example, if you only fly one flight and it's a 2-hour flight, but your airline pays 4 hours minimum day, no matter how many hours you fly, you would put 4 plus 00 here. And any day that you have at least one leg entered as block, it will automatically make your credit at a minimum 4 hours in APDL. Apply a leg rig. This is where you would have each leg of this payroll type based on a ratio or a percentage. This is where you would change, for example, a deadhead if you had a different rate for deadhead pay or extension pay or things of that nature. So this is where I have a good example of deadhead pay. Let's say for this example, your airline pays 75% of your normal pay rate for a deadhead. So in this case, I would increase our the block side to 4 and the credit side to 3. So I have a ratio of 3 to 4 or 75%. And we have a little note at the bottom. A block of 6 hours would credit 4 hours and 30 minutes. In this case, combined with the minimum credit that I have set here above, if I have only one flight that day and it's a deadhead and it credits me with only 75%, it's still going to give me that 4 hours because I have the minimum credit enabled in this case. So you got to make sure you set up your payroll categories with enough difference between the two, enough different payroll categories to cover all circumstances. In this case, most likely I wouldn't have the minimum credit and the leg rig enabled at the same time. Go ahead and set these back to 1, turn that off. Go ahead and delete the minimum credit as well. I can set this as the default payroll category. In this case, it already is, and I cannot delete this category because it is a default category. So going back, let's go look at a few different options. Say deadhead, for example. Everyone should be familiar with a deadhead. This does not apply to flight time. This is not a time where I'm sitting at the controls. I would not enter this in my logbook for purposes of going to an interview and saying this is flight time that I've accrued. However, it is duty, so it is applied to legality, and I do get paid for it. The rest of those do not apply as far as return to gate, above guarantee, that type of thing. Override pay rate, I could set this to 50% or 75% or whatever of my base pay rate. Then I got to do some math, and I got to divide the dollar amount into fractions of a cent, things like that. I don't want to do that, so I would use a leg rig in this case and say, in this case I just get 50% for a deadhead or 75%, whatever's correct at your airline. Going back, let's say a canceled category. In this case, it doesn't apply to flight time. It also doesn't apply to legality because I didn't fly anything. The flight was canceled. If your airline provides cancellation pay, you would get paid for that, so you could have the apply to pay category turned on, and that's all. For that reason, if you do have a canceled flight in APDL, you don't want to delete that flight. You want to set it to canceled so you still reflect the correct payroll for that day. Junior assignment, this is going to be an example where we have above guarantee. By default, that's not turned on, but in this case, I'm going to turn that on. At my airline, that counts. And this is where I would say, well, we get paid 150% for a junior assignment, so I'm going to set that to a ratio of 3 to 2, 150%. So a block of 6 hours would credit 9 hours. Save that one. We do have a couple of other categories in here that I want to point out. Going down, we have the layover category. This is a category that you would use if you were on a trip that had a layover of longer than 24 hours in a certain city. Since APDL won't allow you to have a duty period with nothing in it, we put a layover category in there, and in my case, there's no special pay for that, so I would turn that off, and I would put in one single entry on that day that says layover from this time to this time. Another important category I want to talk about is the pay adjustment category. We have pay adjustment and pay adjustment above guarantee. For the pay adjustment category, apply to pay is the only thing that applies in this case. Not a lot you should really have to change with this, but what you can use the pay adjustment category for is, obviously we're not going to be able to cover every possible scenario for every single airline right away. So you can use a payroll adjustment category to make an adjustment to a certain day of your trip. If there's some feature that APDL doesn't allow in the payroll section that your airline supports, you can use the payroll adjustment category, put in a flat hour amount, and it will adjust your pay for that day by the amount that you've entered, so that your payroll calculations within APDL can be more accurate if your airline uses a more complex method of calculating pay than what we support here in the payroll settings section. Another thing, the rest opportunity category. This is another thing that you wouldn't really need to adjust the settings within the settings section here. but that is important for the split duty trips. So you wouldn't want to really mess up or like change the name of that category and use it for something else, because we do use that for special calculations in the split duty category. And then last, the non-flying duty category here. In this case, this would be if you, let's say you get injured and the company requires you to come in and do office work. You would put down non-flying duty. It's still duty. Has to be counted for in your cumulative limits, look back reports, things of that nature. It's not rest, but it's also not flying, so you still need to keep track of those. Another thing that you can use this for is if your rest is interrupted. One of the concerns with FAR 117 is you must have uninterrupted rest for a certain number of hours, considering the scenario that you fly under. And if for some reason your rest is interrupted by the company, they call you when they're not supposed to call you, it wakes you up, you can put in an entry in APDL, hey, scheduling interrupted my rest, and at this time my rest starts over now. And that's how you would handle that within APDL. That's all we have for the payroll section at the moment. Thanks for watching, and come back for the next video.